the environment and there was the safety and so on, and it was approved. And how much beer has been fermented using that yeast? 0. And the reality is, because for most beers, the vast majority of beers, the most expensive component of the beer is the bottle, and putting the beer into the bottle. And the actual raw materials are relatively low cost, particularly on a larger scale. And so there's an inherent resistance and reluctance of brewers to actually embrace that type of technology. And that applies not only to yeast, it also applies to grain as well. The reality is that some brewers do use commercial enzymes to enhance the process, to help in the process, and those enzymes, many of them are produced using genetically modified organisms. So directly, no brewer that I'm aware of is embracing or is likely to embrace specifically genetically modified materials, other than indirectly in the form of enzymes. And it simply is because a beer, it's not like the pharmaceutical world where you need or benefit from having really complex technology to develop new products. With beer, there probably isn't something that cannot be solved in some other way that is perceived by the brewer as being less of a risk.
All right, so when you homebrew, you're only supposed to repitch a yeast several times because it changes. How do breweries and like yeast producers like White Labs ensure that you're getting a certain type of yeast and it hasn't like evolved to a different type?
I can do that. What happens typically in a commercial brewery, you can repitch your beer, you can repitch your yeast multiple times. If you've maintained oxygenation, if you've maintained a good nutritional balance, if you've maintained the right temperature. Some breweries have really finicky yeast that are diacetyl bombs, and they have to be really careful with their de-rest, even on ales, lagers especially. Depending on what yeast you use, what medias you use to look at that yeast, you're able to screen against those mutations. The biggest mutation that most brewers worry about is petite mutant, or related to oxygen. And as a home brewer or a craft brewer, a small-scale brewer, I don't know that you have to worry so much about repitching as long as you pitch healthy, happy yeast. You're doing your cell counts. You're looking to make sure that it's not taking up the dye, showing that it's dead, showing that it's healthy. You're storing it cool. You're not leaving it warm, letting it go south. The worst thing you can do is leave your beer on the yeast, because while you may not realize you're getting autolytic flavors, over time, once that beer's racked off, it will age very poorly. So I've been with brewers that never get a new strain. They stay with the same strain. They just maintain their practices. My mentor, Joe Awades, was a huge proponent on maintaining a strain and continuing to repitch. Other breweries are adamant not going beyond 8 to 12 generations, and a lot of that has to do with sanitation and yeast management practices.
It's very much dependent on the actual strength of the beer. If you've got very alcoholic beers or relatively alcoholic beers, it's going to stress the yeast. But for the lower alcohol content, it's possible. There are a number of other issues, and they include, depends how you harvest the yeast. If you're harvesting from the cone of a fermenter, the different ages of the yeast settle to different positions. So if you're not careful with collecting the yeast out of the cone, you're going to be selecting different subpopulations. There is one brewery, and I'm sure he's a good friend of mine who won't mind me mentioning this, but Dan Gordon of Gordon Biersch uses newly propagated yeast every fermentation. He never transfers yeast from one fermentation to the next.
Okay, so I'm going to take that and say, if you do use freshly propagated yeast every time, you've developed a flavor profile for your beer that you very much like. A lot of larger brewers and commercial brewers will take that first generation fermentation and spread it across their brewing landscape because it throws high sulfurs. Those are specific to various and different types of breweries. It's kind of the magic of each brewery, how they manage their yeast, but a lot of it has to do with that harvest practice, harvesting the heart of the cone, getting rid of the first stuff that dies on the bottom, and leaving a little bit in the top, on that top layer of the cone, so that it settles down. You want the center. You want the center of the cone.
So is this what like White Labs and White yeast is that using? Is this what White Labs and Y Yeast, do they do something similar? They just brew really low strength beers and just keep harvesting the yeast?
I can't actually say precisely what they do within because I'm not privy to the business. And I'm probably pretty sure they don't do it the way that the yeast companies do it when they're providing commercial yeast, for example, baker's yeast. Mm-hmm. Of course, what they do to maximize the yeast yield and to overcome the Crabtree effect, they have something called fed batch, where they actually feed the yeast with a fairly low concentration of sugar. They have a high level of oxygen. They keep the concentration of sugar low, so basically the yeast respires, and therefore you get increased biomass, and therefore you maximize the yields. I wouldn't think that is how the White Labs of this world and the Y Yeast do it, but I'm pretty sure they're not going from fermentation to fermentation and then just giving you that yeast. I think they'll probably be doing new propagations.
Thank you.
So I have a question for the manufacturing side of it. When you expanded the bottling line and the new brew house and everything, you know, the natural flora and fauna plays so much into your flavor profile and what you can kind of combat. What new issues did you face as you expanded all of that?
Interesting, good question. One of the biggest issues we faced was bringing in water from another well and seeing a change in the microflora. We went to a deeper well, but it was a new well, and with that, you don't only bring the water at the very low, farthest depth, you bring up what is close to the surface. So as a brewer going to a new water source, all of a sudden we were chasing micro that we'd never seen before that was waterborne. Fortunately, it's not any micro that will grow in beer. Beer becomes anaerobic. We've got pH going for us. We've got alcohol content for us. And we also have the bacteriostatic hops that we add. So that was one of the big issues that we faced. Another place we've been looking is in our filtration. What we did as far as how things were planned didn't necessarily come to fruition in the real practical sense. So you have to realize that when you're commissioning, you need to look beyond what's on the paper and follow it through step by step. So we've been working with our brewers and our quality group on commissioning all of our new equipment and all our new processes, taking multiple cuts throughout the life of a run. So if it's a first cut, a second cut, an end of a tank. So we're finding that we're doing a really good job with our CIP, but there have been some variables like the water issue that we didn't expect, especially from a deeper well.
So how do you treat your water differently now in this new well?
So now what we're doing is we're running it through a different set of filters, and we're looking more closely at iron content because there's bacteria, and that was not something that was in the well prior. So very interesting. Bad things happen to happy yeast when there's high concentrations of iron. Fortunately, we caught it in the water. It did not affect our yeast. So we're mitigating the water quality through filtration.
Can I have one more question? Sorry. You were saying also that if it doesn't meet quality standards, it doesn't go to the consumer. Do you rework
Correct.
it all, or does it dump? Do you dump it all, or does it? Can you rework it at all?
Well, it just depends on where it is. Typically, in a commercial brewery, what you want to do is you want to only sell the beer that meets your quality standard to the consumer. If there's a micro issue, we will quarantine that beer. That beer does not go to filtration. It does not go into package. As Charlie was saying, packaging is the most expensive piece of the product's life. So those do not get reworked. If we have an issue with a label going on upside down, those kinds of things can be caught and reworked. It doesn't affect the quality of the beer. So when it's a microbiologic quality issue, that beer is quarantined and typically it is dumped.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. Craft breweries don't pasteurize typically. So also too, to let you know, some of the old world breweries that are very, very large will pasteurize their beers simply because they may have low-level flora that might bloom over time in the package, and through pasteurization, the brewmaster can sleep at night.
And let me just emphasize that the amounts of heat involved in pasteurization are very, very low. and providing the oxygen's low, it's not going to have an adverse effect on flavor. The pasteurization actually will help the foam. I mentioned earlier on the yeast, if you stress it, will produce an enzyme that will damage the proteins. That enzyme is destroyed in the modest amounts of heat that are provided. So if you have a beer that's not pasteurized, you do jeopardize foam stability in the final container.
So I have a couple questions from our online audience. First one was directly for Rebecca from our audience, a group that's watching online at Salisbury University, and they are wondering, what is your favorite Dogfish Head craft brew?
Oh, dang. Usually it's the one that's in front of me.
Good answer.
Unless I'm on panel for tortured beer, which some of my colleagues here know that that's one of the things I like to do a lot, is to taste beer that's been treated badly so that you know what it's like in the market. That's not my favorite beer.
And then sort of a general question from our student audience. They were curious, if you're looking for a career as a microbiologist in a craft brewery or in a larger brewery, do you need to have experience in food science as well, or does having a microbiology background is that enough to get you started?
Oh, that's really good. That's two-pronged, actually. Any experience that a young person can get coming out of college in manufacturing is a great springboard coming into a brewery and working in the quality department, working into microbiology. It's not typical that you become the chief microbiologist just because you've got a great degree, a 4-year degree, a master's degree, even a PhD, unless you have experience. So my strongest recommendation is to find a brewery that offers an internship, find multiple opportunities to work throughout summer in production environments, learn as much as you can about food safety, microbiology, and then use that as a springboard to come into the brewery. You could come in as a brewer, you could come into the packaging department, you could come into the quality department, and then you could become a specialist if you wanted to get into microbiology.
I think it's very important to remember that I always regard microbiology of brewing holistically. It's all very well saying, well, what are the organisms there? How many of them are there? But I think we would all agree in the industry that what we really need to worry about is how do we design breweries such that they're easy to clean? How do we protect, through a quality assurance approach, against problems, microbiological and so on. And I think also some experience, if people want to go in the industry and have learned from how microbiology is done elsewhere, will be a very useful thing. I used to get very frustrated. I was a QA manager at a brewery in the north of England for a while, and I used to get very frustrated by every Wednesday afternoon sitting down with my assistant and with the packaging guy talking about 7-day counts for beer that was already in the marketplace. And there's very little point in worrying about microbiology after the event. So it's up front, and at the very least it's rapid microbiology. I've always been very interested in rapid microbiological techniques, but more importantly is design of the plant, cleaning the plant, the cleaning in place systems, sterilants and so on, selection of those, and understanding what you're doing. And so it's not only the microbiology, it's a holistic understanding of brewing, and we're better to learn that than to come to UC Davis.
Hi, I've got a question for, I guess, both of you. As a home brewer in DC, this area, I live in Arlington, Northern Virginia, there's a lot of chloramine in the water that we have to test or get rid of. So what's happening with chloramine and the chlorines to kill the yeast biologically, and what do you guys do about sterilization at Dogfish Head?
She's going to have to answer that one.
Okay. Chloramines you can get out, I believe, through filtration. I've not had any specific experience with high chloramines and yeast health. I've been asked, but in the testing that we've done in the commercial breweries that I've worked, there's never been a problem. So I'm sorry, I can't help the home brewer on that. You're asking me about sterilization?
Yeah, what do you do otherwise with all your tanks?
For sanitation, for cleaning in place?
Yeah.
Okay, so all of our tanks tanks, depending on if it's a fermentation, which carries the highest load, or a bright beer tank, a finished beer tank, which carries the lowest load. Every tank gets rinsed. It gets a caustic step, rinsed, acid, and then it has a sanitizer. And we use peracetic acid. A lot of brewers use other types of sanitizers. I used to work with a brewery that filled the tank up with water and quaternary ammonium solution and then drained it out and brought the beer in. But that's a tremendous footprint for wastewater usage.
Yeah, sure.
So we're looking, most of the breweries that I've been working with in the last decade or so are looking at issues of sustainability and water recapture, water recycling. So that's another career as a microbiologist. Look at wastewater, look at sustainability and utilizing water in a brewery setting. I know it's big in poultry, I know it's big in canning. Sorry, that's way off topic what you asked, but it's really important to, again, to Charlie's point, design your brewery, even if it's your small brewery, a nano brewery, design it with success in mind. So take out as many elbows as you can, take out as many connections as you can, hard pipe as much as works. And then when you go in to clean, make sure you don't have any shadows or dead spaces. And if you're hand cleaning, that's fine. If you don't have a ball, like a sprinkler ball or a jet, a spray ball, if you will, and you're cleaning it, just make sure you clean it to bright and rinse it very well. Keep everything you use scrubbed up and dry. Don't cap wet. Things grow in the damp recesses of the Mid-Atlantic like nobody's business. I've never seen so much mold coming from the West Coast. It's crazy. So design for success. And then if you work for a brewer, talk to your brewer about not having a quality control mentality. You know, don't have beer police, like Charlie was saying. At 7 days, it's too late. Talk about quality improvement. Talk about quality integration. Our department is very, very small. We're a lean group of ninjas that go out into the brewery and work with the brewers. So we're not chasing anybody over bad beer. We're working to be preemptive and proactive.
Cool. Thank you.
Earlier this evening, I had the pleasure of reading the report that came out on yeast and brewing, which I found very educational. One of the things I was a little surprised at was the apparently Brettanomyces plays such a large role in lambic beers. And as a wine microbiologist and someone who's worked with wines before, Brettanomyces is a spoilage yeast that causes lots of problems with musty aromas, etc. So could you sort of wax philosophical a little bit about why Brettanomyces is so important for lambics and yet is such detrimental for wines?
Well, I think it basically boils down to attitude and perception, and you're absolutely right. You know, that Vinnie Cilurzo embraces Brettanomyces fills a lot of people in Napa Valley with horror, and the very fact that he is celebrating it in where he is of concern to them. You know, these lambic beers, I mean, they're basically spontaneous. So, I mean, you know, you specify Brettanomyces, a whole range of other organisms that most people will say, oh my gosh, I really don't think so. So it really does lend itself to well, it just basically takes us back to a style of beer which is celebrated in Belgium. Now, I can't knock back 2 or 3 pints of these beers, but if I'm sipping some with some cheese or something like that, it's amazing what the actual effects that are going on and the actual the way in which they do complement one another. So they are a real challenge. They're very sour, these products, and of course they've got the Brett character as well. If you've got Brettanomyces floating around in, let's take a beer at random, Coors Light, they ain't going to be happy with that. And the vast majority, 99.9% of beers worldwide, they very studiously will avoid anything like that. And so it really is historical that Brettanomyces was associated with the beers in Britain. An IPA in Britain now, you won't find Brettanomyces, so that mentality has gone. But still, there are these products that are a challenge to many people to drink, but nonetheless are interesting. And I was saying this to somebody earlier on today, that, I mean, the craft sector, particularly in this country, is pushing the envelope. They're pushing to more and more extremes. And they're looking for points of difference. And from a microbiological perspective, this is one of them. But there are other strange things, I think I was saying to you actually, that are being introduced into beer that I question. But there are certain types of product, and lambic is the most famous, where Brettanomyces just happens to be one of the organisms that does develop. So few and far between are the brewers that specifically dose it in. Although there is one, and that is a collaboration between Russian River and Sierra Nevada. Now I would say, and Ken Grossman was Rebecca's old boss, he is probably the most impressive guy I've ever met in the brewing industry in 35 years. And I couldn't believe it when he agreed to have Brettanomyces in his brewery. And what he's doing is actually literally dosing it into the finished bottle just before they put the cap in. But he's got it under control. But there aren't many people going to run that risk.
I won't wax about it because I have really strong feelings. I think that it has a place. I think that there are some really great brewers out there using it and using it very wisely. I think that you have to use it similar to the way Sierra Nevada is using it in a very controlled environment. It offers a flavor profile that's unique, and it's unique to the base of the beer that it's brought into. If you were to take a light American lager and introduce it to Brettanomyces, you would not like what you were drinking. I have worked with breweries that created a goose-like Cosmic Mother Funk, and they use it in the slightest amount of dosing, and it makes their beers incredible. They have a barrel room collection that's really awesome. At Dogfish Head, we have barrels specifically marked for Brettanomyces. Those barrels will not see our stainless steel. They will get racked off and put into kegs that are specifically marked for them or hand-packed. We do not have any Brettanomyces in our main lineup of beers. It doesn't mean that we won't. But to Charlie's point, if you are a good brewer, and by a good brewer you are 90% janitor, you are cleaning all the time, and cleanliness makes the difference in the consistency of your beer, then when you do bring in Brettanomyces, you will bring it in a very specified way, in a very specialized manner, and clean, test, once you've finished.
Which is what happens at Russian River. I mean, everything is color-coded. So all the transfer lines going from fermenter and so on, there should never be any something getting screwed up to the wrong connection. Should never happen.
So I have a couple more questions from our online audience, and one is sort of a more basic question about yeast. How does one define or characterize age for a single-celled organism? And then kind of a follow-up question related to it is, are there other uses for used-up yeast other than like Marmite?
Age, most brewers would judge the age if they got a handy scanning electron microscope to hand. On the basis of...
I think there's an app for that.
Bud scars. So, the more often it divides and more often it spawns off daughter cells, then the more bud scars. So basically that is another way in which brewers more traditionally discuss age. They talk about generations. And when they talk about generations, they're talking about the number of times that a yeast has been transferred from one fermentation to the next. And the second part of the question, I think, was, other uses for yeast. Yeah, I'll never forget going to a brewery in Kent, and they had a farm right next door, and they transferred the yeast as a slurry to this farm and opened the sluice gates, and the pigs went wild. I mean, absolutely wild. And of course, they were all soused on this alcohol in the yeast. They were very happy and got fatter and fatter and fatter. It can be used for animal feed. Some of it goes off to other industries. For example, there's been a history of distillers taking yeast from breweries because they're not so much concerned as many brewers are about the yeast strain. When I was research manager for Bass, we actually spawned off a daughter company called Delta Biotechnology. And our idea with that was to genetically modify the yeast to actually produce high-value proteins, such as human serum albumin. And the concept was that we would carry out the fermentation, then we'd recover the yeast, flick a metabolic switch on the HSA, and we never did. It never happened. I think the company still exists. We just sold it off and so on. So I think those are the main uses. And of course, yeast is the ultimate health food.
Nothing more to add.
Quickie about complexity. Also, yeast distillers' grain are also used for cattle feeds here in the U.S. About complexity, Pilsner Urquell. I loved the Pilsner Urquell that the commies made, and then when they threw them out and they put in the stainless.
Who made?
Pilsner Urquell.
Yeah, who made it?
Well, it was made in Pilsner.
All right. Okay.
All right.
I just missed the word.
But when they made it more efficient, lost a lot of the floral notes. And then when I visited Pilsen and had the stuff from the old oak tanks, I tasted those floral notes again. So what's going on there? Yeast? Surely it's not the oak tanks. It's got to be some other bugs going on.
Commercially, what happens when a beer loses a lot of the flavor that you may well remember, it can happen when they grow too quickly or they grow very exponentially and they more rapidly move the beer through the tank, or if they ferment hotter temperatures faster. So they'll lose a lot of those volatiles. They may have changed their hops bring in floral flavors. Also, too, you were probably someplace you were really enjoying, so that experience brought Technicolor to your memory of how that beer tasted. So analytically, it may be the same, but your memory's changed.
And I think that's a good point. I just make two things. The first is you can get Pilsner Urquell in Davis, California, but it tastes nothing like it does in the Czech Republic for the simple reason it's come thousands of miles. And the vast majority of beers do not travel like that. They develop the flavors of cardboard and tomcat pea and who knows what else. And that is why, although people don't like it, the best way to produce, the best beer is usually the beer as close to the brewery as possible. So something like Bass Ale these days is going to be better in America, in this part certainly, than it was when it was shipped over from London or from Burton-on-Trent, for the simple reason these days it's brewed in New York. But they've adjusted the water, they got the right water, they got the right malt, they got the right hops, they got the right yeast, they can produce it so much better. But the second point is very, very valid, that people actually, a lot of it is, and I'm not saying this is the case in your case, but certainly there is a psychological component. Back in Bass, back in the day, they used to ferment in something called the Burton Union system, where the yeast would ferment in barrels and then rise and then go through a trough from barrel to barrel to barrel. And they still do Marstons that way. Bass didn't like that from a hygienic perspective, and they moved into open square fermenters. And of course, being a responsible brewing company, loads and loads and loads and loads of trials to make sure the product was absolutely a wonderful match, whichever way you made it. But as soon as people said, oh, they don't use the Burton Union system anymore, it's rubbish, and so people, they tell themselves a story.
These two questions have to be quick because we're almost out of time.
Oh, okay. Well, my question's towards Rebecca. I've noticed that the 120 and the Palo are relatively similar from year to year. However, when the Worldwide is made, it's not, and I kind of love that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how QC is involved with the brewers from deciding what the flavor profile is, and how you're going to get to that point of making something such a high alcohol beer and still something delicious.
Okay, thanks. Amazing. We just had a vertical, I'm looking at my colleagues, of the Worldwide Stout, and we tasted back to 2005. And you're spot on. It was different every single year. What has happened at Dogfish is as Dogfish has grown, the brewers have changed. While the recipes haven't, often the yeast management has changed. Time in the tank has changed. The rate of fermentation has changed based on yeast management. So the worldwide stout, the ingredients haven't changed, but the way we've managed our yeast has. So while I look forward to more consistency, especially with the Palo, like you were saying, in the 120, the worldwide, Tippy, we're brewing it again, and it just is really mean to our yeast. It's a high alcohol. It starts out with a high OG. The grain bill has a lot of dark malt in it. If you had the chance to taste the Bitches Brew tonight from our music series, very tobacco, very acrid. We've worked really hard on that as far as getting that consistent from year to year. So to your point, I think most of it had to do with our yeast health and our yeast management. And so while I want it to be consistent, I really appreciate the flavor difference from year to year. And when you can line it up and taste what would be similar to a vertical of wine, and you have a vertical of beer, and you get to taste what age does to very high alcohol beers, it's really fun. And it's not a big investment at the price of a 4-pack or a $7.50 bottle, unlike wine. So, did that answer it okay? Okay.
For beers such as a Hefeweizen or Belgian beers that you'd like to get a lot of phenol character, I've heard various opinions of under-pitching yeast, over-pitching yeast, colder temperature to stress the yeast to give more phenol character. Can you speak to that? Do you have a particular opinion?
Specifically for the Hefeweizen, the phenolic character being the 4-vinyl guaiacol, you've got to use the right yeast strain, but I think the trick is more to do with the mashing than anything else. And if you extract the grain at a relatively lower temperature, so instead of mashing directly in at, say, 65 degrees Celsius, you would mash in at something like 45 degrees Celsius, the enzyme that releases the ferulic acid precursor is going to be encouraged. And so you're going to produce more ferulic acid, and then there's more substrate for the yeast then to convert into 4-vinyl guaiacol.
I would agree with that. But I would also say, working with a brewery that had a commercially produced beer, you do get changes from generation to generation with the higher phenolic yeast strains. And so you cannot, in my opinion, continue to repitch multiple generations. My experience is no greater than 4 generations for those highly aroma-active yeasts.
And there's one other component to do with that type of yeast. Not only is it making the phenolic clovey character, it's also making banana, isoamyl acetate. And the way to encourage that is always an open square fermenter with a low hydrostatic pressure. If you put it in a deep fermenter with a high hydrostatic pressure, you'll cut down the level of esters.
All right, so I have a pair of questions from our online chat room.
They have to be really quick.
Pardon?
They have to be really quick.
Okay, well, hopefully. I don't know. It all depends on their answer. The first question is, what sort of yardsticks do you have for determining if yeast is repitchable? And then if you do decide to cold store your yeast, how long could you potentially do so?
Most brewers check the viability using methylene blue. So you're looking for a pretty high viability. And storage, different people have different views, but storing it cold and gently mix so there's not going to become any hot spots and so on.
I like vitality over viability. We use both a hemocytometer cell counter, and then we have a Nexalome salometer, which does it automatically with a fluorescent dye. You can use that when you get to a bigger place with more money, more tools in your arsenal for your quality program. I agree with Charlie storing cold, but don't store too cold. I think that agitation is good, light agitation is fine. Lots of different breweries have lots of different ideas on the best way to do it. Make sure that you don't store too cold and expect cold yeast to jump into warm wort and start fermenting right away. It's like jumping into the ocean that's really, really cold and expecting you're going to swim really, really far, really fast. It doesn't work.
All right. Well, I hope that you all now have, those of you who didn't come in with an appreciation of what a complex and microbiological process it is to produce beer with exactly the characteristics that you want time after time. I was really impressed by that in writing this booklet. Keep your eyes on your email for the announcement of the next Microbes After Hours, probably be in the early spring. We don't know the topic yet. If you have ideas for topics, go ahead and tweet them to us or email them to us and we'll consider it. Take some time to look around the ASM website. We have a lot of wonderful educational activities going on, teacher resources, and our international department is doing wonderful things around the world to increase microbiology capacity and to encourage microbiologists who are being trained in resource-poor areas. So I really encourage you to look around and learn more about what ASM has to offer and what microbiologists do all over the world. I'd like to ask you to give our speakers a hand and thank them. And we'll see you at the next meeting.
Once you're in the BSL-4 space, the only way you can get out is to go through a chemical shock.
It's an unusual room, never seen anything like this. Anybody who has access to this facility first has to go through an R scan. So the HEPA filters filter the air coming out of the facility, and that will remove bacteria, viruses, anything that might constitute any kind of risk, right? Remember, this building is basically a second building inside the main building.